You have seen this place. The pastel houses stacked up a cliff like something poured and left to set in the sun, the turquoise water. The lemons the size of your two hands together. You have seen it on 1,000 screens, in 1,000 photographs, behind 1,000 strangers smiling at the same railing. You know exactly what it looks like. You could draw it from memory with your eyes shut. So here is the strange part. Almost everything that makes this coast extraordinary, you have never seen at all. It lives above the road no car can climb. It lies under the streets you walk on. It rests on the floor of the sea, under the same bright water in every photograph anyone has ever taken here. And it begins with a town of 4,000 people that once ruled the Mediterranean. This is the Amalfi Coast. And the picture in your head is the thinnest skin of it. Peel that skin back, just once, and the whole place changes shape in your hands. Start with the arrival, because the arrival is a kind of warning. There is one road. One. It clings to the rock between Sorrento and Salerno, cut into the side of the mountain a few hundred meters above the water, and it does not behave the way a road is supposed to behave. It doubles back on itself. It vanishes into tunnels of raw stone and comes out somewhere you did not expect. It narrows until two buses meet nose to nose on a blind curve, and one of them simply has to stop and breathe in while the other eases past with a hand's width to spare. On your left, the cliff climbs straight up into terraced green. On your right, there is nothing at all. Just air, and then the sea, a long way down, holding the morning light like a sheet of hammered metal. If you take that road by bus, you will notice something about the driver. He is not nervous. He has done this 10,000 times. He takes the curves with one hand and a kind of bored grace, leaning on the horn before each blind bend, and the horn is not anger, it is conversation, a language the whole coast speaks. You, meanwhile, are gripping the seat in front of you and laughing at yourself for gripping it, and the smell comes through the open window before you have fully stopped moving. Salt first. Then something sharper underneath it, green and sweet at once, almost too much to be real. That is the lemons. You do not understand yet how completely this coast belongs to that smell. You will, by the end, it gets into everything. The first town stops you the way a held breath stops you. The houses do not sit beside one another. They sit on top of one another, white and ochre and faded rows, climbing the gorge in tiers, balconies hanging over balconies, laundry strung between them like the flags of some small, private country. Bougainvillea pours down the walls in a purple so saturated it looks switched on. Cats sleep in the thin shade. Somewhere a moped complains up a staircase that should not allow a moped. A church bell, cracked and sweet, marks some hour that no longer matters. The smell of strong coffee cuts across the lemon and the salt. The whole arrangement should slide into the water under its own weight. It has been refusing to slide into the water for more than 1,000 years, and it refuses with a kind of ease, as though it has simply never once occurred to it to fall. Stand in the main square of Amalfi town and look up. There is a cathedral at the top of a wide stone staircase, and its front is a single sheet of gold and black and arches, a striped, glittering fever dream of a building. With Christ enthroned in mosaic high on the facade catching the sun. It looks like something carried here from a far more important place and set down by mistake. That is your first real clue. Because it was not carried here. It belongs here. This small town was once a far more important place. Here is the thing nobody prints on the postcard. Between the year 839 and around the year 1200, this was a republic, not a village pretending to grandeur. A genuine maritime power. One of only 4 in all of medieval Italy, standing beside Venice, beside Genoa, beside Pisa. 4 cities that carved up the trade of the entire Mediterranean between them. And for a long stretch of those years, the strongest of the 4 was not Venice, and it was not Genoa. It was this. It was Amalfi. 4,000 people live today where an empire of the sea once kept its capital. Its ships ran to North Africa, to Syria, to the coast of what is now Lebanon, to Byzantium itself, carrying timber out and coming home low in the water with gold and spices and silk. Its merchants grew so wealthy they founded a hospital and a church in faraway Jerusalem. And here is the detail I love most. To this very day, the flag of the modern Italian Navy carries the emblems of those 4 old republics, and one of the 4 crosses on that flag belongs to this pastel town you thought you already understood. Let that settle for a moment. The pretty harbor in your photographs used to divide the sea with Venice. And the proof of it is still standing, down by the water, if you know to look. Behind the seafront there are two great stone halls, low and dim and ribbed with rows of pointed arches marching back into the shadow. This was the arsenal, the shipyard of the Republic. This is where they laid the keels and raised the ribs of the famous Amalfi galleys, the fastest and most agile ships in the Mediterranean of their day. The vessels that carried this town's flag to Africa and the East. The crowds wander past the entrance on their way to a gelato, and inside, in the cool gloom, the bones of a vanished sea power still hold up their own roof. And the rivalry itself never fully died. Every single year, the four old maritime republics, Amalfi, Venice, Genoa and Pisa, still meet and race against one another, crews straining at the oars of ornate historic boats, each city in its own colors, the whole pageant rotating between the four towns. 1,000 years after the empire fell, 4,000 people in a town on a cliff still send a boat out to settle, all over again, who truly rules the sea. Imagine telling a friend that the medieval superpowers of Italy never actually stopped competing, they just turned it into a regatta. If that just shifted something in your head, subscribe to Unseen Countries, because the deeper we go down into this coast, the less it resembles the place you thought you were looking at. And we have not even gone inside that cathedral yet. So let us go inside. Pass under the front of the church and you reach a pair of bronze doors, dark and heavy and incised with silver figures. Those doors did not come from anywhere nearby. They were cast in Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine world, and shipped here as a gift more than 900 years ago by a wealthy Amalfi merchant. Back when men from this coast moved through Constantinople like they owned a piece of it, which in a sense they did, they were among the first doors of their kind anywhere in Italy. Beyond the doors, off to one side, there is a cloister, and you should slow down here. They call it the Cloister of Paradise. It was built in the 13th century to hold the tombs of the town's nobles, and it is a quiet rectangle of interlaced white arches around a small green garden, palm fronds throwing soft shade. The whole thing carrying a faint Moorish grace that tells you, again, that this coast always faced east as much as it faced Rome. 120 slender columns. Bird song. The hush of a place built to feel like the threshold between earth and sky. And then there is the staircase down. Down into the crypt. The air changes as you descend, going cool and still and faintly mineral, the noise of the square overhead falling away step by step until there is only the sound of your own feet and the low gold light of the chapel below. And in that crypt, under this town of 4,000 people, rest the relics of Saint Andrew. Not a saint you have half heard of. Andrew the Apostle, one of the first disciples of Jesus, the brother of Saint Peter, brought here from the east and laid beneath the floor of this church more than 800 years ago. Orthodox pilgrims still travel here from across the world to stand in that crypt. There is even an old tradition that on certain days a mysterious liquid forms on the saint's tomb, which the faithful call the manna, and whether you believe a word of it or not, the fact remains plain and astonishing. One of the 12 apostles lies under the floor of a town most travelers can only describe as cute. This is the rule of the whole place, and you are starting to feel it now. The surface is the easy part. The surface is true, and it is lovely, and it is also a lid. Lift the lid, walk through one set of bronze doors, climb one staircase the crowd is too busy to climb, and the coast opens downward into something far older and far stranger than the view. So keep that instinct, up the staircase, behind the headland, under the floor, and now, let us use it to go up. Because the second secret of this coast is direction. Everybody comes for the shoreline. The shoreline is the floor. The coast does not truly live on its floor. It lives on the wall above it, the vertical world stacked between the road and the sky, and you can stand in the middle of famous Amalfi and never once suspect it is there. Walk 5 minutes east, around a single shoulder of rock, and you arrive somewhere that feels impossible. It is called Atrani. It is one of the smallest towns in all of Italy, folded into a single narrow gorge, and it sits so close to famous Amalfi that the two almost touch, and yet the crowd never makes the turn. They do not know there is a turn to make. So Atrani simply goes on being itself. A handful of fishing boats pulled up on a small gray beach. A church with a green dome. A maze of covered alleys and stone staircases so tight that the sunlight only reaches the bottom of them for an hour each day, so that you climb out of cool shadow into sudden gold and back into shadow again. Old women lean out of windows above your head and call to one another across the gap. A cat watches you from a step worn into a smooth dip by 500 years of feet. There is a single small square with a single cafe, and you can sit there with a coffee that costs almost nothing and watch an entire town be a town, with absolutely no one performing it for anyone. That is the gift, and it is everywhere here once you learn to look. The famous parts are the lid. Lift the lid, walk a few minutes in any direction the crowd will not go, and the real coast is right there, breathing slowly, completely unbothered by you. Now go higher. Past the last of the houses, where the staircases stop being streets and start being paths, the green takes over the slope, and the green is not wild. Look closely and you will see that it is built. Every slope you can see, all the way up to the ridgeline, is cut into terraces, each one held in place by a wall of bare stone, stacked one above another like the steps of a giant who walked up out of the sea. The locals call those walls masseer. Some of them are taller than 3 men standing on each other's shoulders. Some of them are more than 1,000 years old. They were raised entirely by hand, one stone fitted against the next without a drop of mortar, the largest stones laid at the bottom and the smallest at the top, so that the rain runs straight through them and never tears them down. Nobody famous built these. Whole villages built these, slowly, over centuries, just to make a cliff hold soil, and growing on every one of those terraces, under low pergolas of chestnut wood, are the lemons. Not lemons the way you know them. The lemon of this coast has its own name, the sfusato, long and tapered and pale, with a thick, perfumed, almost sweet skin you can peel and eat on its own. A single one can weigh as much as a small melon, heavy and cool in your 2 hands. Pick one off the tree, drag your thumbnail across the rind, and the scent that lifts off it does not just say lemon. It says somewhere. It is exactly the smell that came through your car window on the way in, only multiplied 1,000 times over. Hanging warm and thick in the air between the terraces at 6 in the morning while the light comes up gold and slow across the old stone. And here is what almost no visitor ever sees, because it happens up here, above the road, before the towns below are even awake. These lemons are not grown on flat ground by machines. There is no flat ground. They are grown on the near vertical face of a mountain. And so the people who grow them are not really farmers in the way you picture a farmer, they are something closer to climbers. They go up before dawn along narrow stone stairs, hundreds of meters above the sea, and they fill broad baskets with fruit, and then they carry those baskets back down on their own backs. A full load can weigh as much as a grown adult. 70 kilos of lemons, balanced on one human spine, coming down a staircase cut into a 1,000-year-old wall, with the entire blue Mediterranean opening up below their feet. To do this work you cannot only understand fruit. You have to be a stonemason, to keep the walls standing through the winter rains. You have to be a carpenter, to build and mend the chestnut pergolas. You have to be a water engineer, to keep the rain feeding the roots instead of washing the soil out from under them. None of this knowledge lives in a book. It is handed from a grandfather to a father to a child, on the terrace, in the doing of it, in the weight of the basket and the placing of the stone. Some of these families have worked the very same gardens for 6 generations. And only last year did the wider world finally take official notice, when the lemon gardens of this coast were recognized as one of the most remarkable agricultural landscapes anywhere on Earth, a living heritage worth protecting. If the thought of those men carrying their entire harvest down a cliff on their backs, every single morning, just so the air down here can smell the way it does, gave you even a small shiver, tap the like button right now. I mean that simply. A like is the one signal that tells me to keep finding places that run like this, places with a hidden engine turning quietly underneath the beautiful surface, places that earn the view instead of just selling it. And the lemon does not stop at the terrace. The lemon runs through everything you will taste here. It is shaved raw over fish that was in the sea this same morning. It is candied and folded into a soft, wet sponge cake in a tiny bakery down in Minori that has been making the very same recipe for longer than anyone alive can remember. A cake so simple and so good it makes you briefly angry at every other cake. And at the end of every long lunch, somewhere in a cool dark room, the lemon becomes the thing this coast is most famous for. Limoncello. Just the peel, just alcohol, just sugar, just time. They bring it to the table in a bottle frosted opaque with cold, and it pours thick and slow and faintly glowing, the color of the inside of the fruit, And the first sip is so cold and so sharp that your jaw aches with it, and then half a second later the sweetness arrives, round and warm. And you understand all at once why the whole table goes quiet at this point in the evening. You are not drinking a liqueur. You are drinking the cliff. You are drinking the smell that came through the car window. The entire place, distilled down into one cold mouthful and handed to you on a saucer. And the best hour on this coast is the one right after that. The light goes long and soft. The heat finally breaks. And the towns come out of their houses. They call it the Passeggiata, and it is not a tourist event, it is simply what people here do at the end of every day. The narrow streets fill, slowly, with no hurry anywhere in it. Grandmothers in cardigans walk arm in arm. Teenagers cluster on the church steps pretending not to watch each other. Small children chase one another around the fountain in the square while their parents stand and talk, and keep talking, the way people talk when no one has anywhere they need to be. Somewhere a church bell counts the hour and nobody checks it. The smell of garlic and frying fish drifts out of doorways. A man waters the geraniums on a balcony 3 floors up. This is the part of the coast no camera ever quite catches, because it is not a view, it is a rhythm, the unhurried pulse of a place that has been living exactly like this, in these exact streets, for longer than your country has had a name. Stand in it for one evening and you stop wanting to photograph the coast. You start wanting to belong to it. Sit with that for a second. And then come back down to the water, because there is a town down there you have absolutely seen, the most photographed town on the whole coast, and it is hiding something underneath it that nobody in the photographs has any idea is there. Its name is Positano. You know it even if you do not know that you know it. It is the one that spills down its own ravine in a cascade of pale houses toward a small dark beach, the one painters and film directors cannot leave alone, the one that looks less like a town and more like a wave of buildings frozen the instant before it breaks. Long before it was any of that, it was a quiet fishing village. And long before that, it was a Roman holiday. Because directly under the church at the heart of Positano, 11 meters down beneath the painted dome everyone photographs, there is a Roman villa, a real one. A grand seaside house where wealthy Romans came to do nothing at all, 2,000 years ago. And in the year 79, when Vesuvius erupted along this same stretch of coast and buried Pompeii, the same eruption buried this villa too, sealing it under ash, and then time buried it deeper. And a church was built on top, and the centuries simply rolled over it and forgot. Until the year 2003, when workers repairing the church crypt broke through into a room nobody had stood in for 1900 years. What they found down there is breathtaking, and it is cool and dim and silent even when the town above is blazing with heat and crowds. Frescoes. Whole walls of them, in reds and golds and blues so vivid they look freshly mixed, mythical creatures and floating figures painted in the same Pompeian style, preserved by the very disaster that should have destroyed them. You can walk above it now on a glass and steel path, looking down into a Roman dining room while, 11 meters over your head, tourists eat gelato and have no idea. The Postcard town has a Pompeii in its basement. Do you feel the pattern locking into place now? The surface, and then the thing beneath the surface. Always the thing beneath the surface. Hold that, and let us climb one last time, to the level of this coast that seems to have given up on the ground entirely. Its name is Ravello, and it sits so high above the sea that the people who built it appear to have decided to stop living on land and start living in the sky. The road up is a string of switchbacks that make your ears pop and your stomach drop. And at the top there are gardens, attached to old villas. And these gardens are why composers and writers and exhausted famous people have been coming up here for 150 years to sit very still and be quietly undone. In one of them, there is a terrace. It runs straight out to the lip of the cliff and then simply stops, lined along its edge with a row of pale marble busts all facing out to sea, and beyond them there is nothing. Only the drop, and the gulf, and the sky folding down into the water with no seam between them. They call it the Terrace of Infinity, and for once a name on this coast is not trying to sell you anything, because that is exactly what it is. Stand there in the late afternoon, when the light slides from white to gold to deep amber, when the day's heat lifts off the warm stone and the swifts come out to cut the cooling air into ribbons, and the whole coast lies beneath you in soft descending layers of blue going grayer and hazier all the way to the edge of the world. Nobody up there talks much. There is nothing useful left to say. And there is a second garden in Ravello, just a few steps away, that may be the reason this little town in the sky is loved by people who have never set foot in Italy. In the summer of 1880, a composer climbed up here. His name was Richard Wagner, and he had been searching for years for the right vision of a magical garden for the second act of his final opera. He walked into these terraced gardens hanging over the sea, and he stopped, and he is said to have written that he had found it at last, the enchanted garden he had been imagining. So real to him was this place that he built it into the opera. And ever since, every single summer, this town answers him. They build a stage out over the very edge of the cliff, a platform suspended above 1,000 feet of open air, and a full symphony orchestra plays there. The music drifting out over the dark water with nothing behind the musicians but the gulf and the stars. There is one concert, the most famous of them, that begins before dawn. People stay awake the whole night for it. The orchestra plays as the black sky over the sea goes gray, then pink, then gold, and the sun lifts itself out of the Mediterranean while the strings climb, and grown adults sit on a cliff in Ravello and weep quietly into the cool morning air. Imagine telling a friend you watched the sun rise over the Amalfi Coast to the sound of a live orchestra playing in a garden that made Wagner stop in his tracks. Now, remember where we started. The pastel houses, the boats on the turquoise water, the thing you have seen 1,000 times. We are nearly ready to go under it. But there is one more taste of this coast to find first. In a village the tour buses skip because it has no famous beach and no famous hotel, only a working harbor and a secret 2,000 years deep. The boats here are not for tourists. They go out at night, around May, with great lamps mounted on the smaller craft to draw the fish up out of the black water. Picture it from the shore. The harbor dark and quiet, and then, far out, a scatter of lights low on the water, swaying, and beneath each light a slow silver boiling as the anchovies rise toward the glow. The boats come home before dawn, heavy and low, the catch sliding cold and gleaming into crates while the town still sleeps. The village is Cetara, and it makes something that will quietly reorder your sense of how old the food on your plate can be. You have eaten Roman food, you almost certainly never knew it. 2,000 years ago, the Romans were obsessed with a sauce. They put it on nearly everything, the way we reach for salt. They made it by packing fish in salt and letting it slowly break down into a dark, intense, savory liquid, and they shipped it in clay jars to every corner of their empire, and they called it garum. And then Rome fell, and the recipe very nearly vanished from the world. Very nearly. It survived in a few hidden pockets of this exact coast, kept alive, the story goes, by monks who salted anchovies in wooden barrels and noticed a strange amber liquid weeping out through the gaps between the staves. That liquid never disappeared. They still make it in Cetara today, in small barrels of chestnut wood, almost precisely the way it was made when the emperors were alive. They call it colatura di alici. The anchovies rest in salt for months. Then a tiny hole is opened in the base of the barrel, and the liquid comes out one slow drop at a time, the color of dark honey, and it is filtered and bottled. And a single teaspoon of it carries the whole concentrated weight of the sea. Toss it through hot spaghetti with nothing more than garlic, good olive oil, a little parsley and a few drops of the cliff-grown lemon, and you are eating, almost unchanged, a dish a Roman would have recognized on his own table 2,000 years ago. A few years ago it was given an official seal of protection, but the families of Cetara have been protecting it far longer than any law. So here is what I keep turning over, and this is the part where I genuinely want your answer down in the comments. Of everywhere we have stood together on this coast so far, the gold-drenched terrace at Ravello, the empty little square in Atrani at dawn, the lemon walls hanging above the road, the Roman dining room 11 meters under Positano, the harbor at Cetara with the sauce of fallen Rome still dripping from the barrel, which single one would you choose to wake up in, just once, with nowhere in the world to be all day? Tell me below. I read every one of them, and they are never the answers I expect. Because there is one more thing this coast makes, and it is even stranger than a 2,000-year-old sauce, it makes the paper the Pope writes on. Tucked into a green valley behind Amalfi town there is a stream, and along that stream there were once around 60 mills. Not flour mills. Paper mills. This coast learned the craft of making paper from the same Arab world its merchants traded with, centuries before most of Europe had any idea how it was done, and for a long stretch of history, the fine, soft, Hand-pressed paper of Amalfi was prized across the continent for letters and documents that mattered. 60 mills once turned and dripped and pressed in that single valley. Today, exactly one of them still works, run by the same family across generations, still beating cotton rag into pulp and lifting it into sheets by hand, one at a time. The way it was done 500 years ago. And that single surviving mill is the official supplier of paper to the Vatican. When the Pope sets his hand to a document, the page beneath his pen most likely came from a hidden valley on this coast that almost no visitor ever bothers to walk into. Sit with the full inventory for a moment. You came here for a view. You are standing in the place that makes the paper of the Vatican. That keeps Rome's lost sauce alive on the tongue. That shelters an apostle in its crypt and a Pompeii in its basement. And that, somewhere in those Golden Republic years, took a strange idea drifting in from far to the east, the magnetic needle that always swings to point north, and refined it into the form that would guide European ships across open ocean for the next 500 years. The local legend hands all the credit to a single inventor with a fine ringing name, and the honest truth is that he probably never existed as one man, but the deeper truth holds firm and clear. The instrument that opened the entire age of sea exploration was sharpened right here, in this small bright town, by sailors who could already find their way to anywhere the water reached. Keep that in your mind, the needle settling, finding north. Because the needle is about to point us straight down. Before it does, take one short detour, because the coast keeps a piece of pure theater hidden between two of its towns and shows it to almost no one. There is a place called Furore, and people call it a village, but you can drive through the spot where its center should be and never see a village at all, because it has no center and no square, just houses scattered up the mountainside like dropped seeds. What Furore has instead is a wound in the cliff. A narrow gorge, where the rock splits clean open and the sea drives straight in, a slot of cold green water trapped between two enormous walls of stone, with a single high bridge arching across the top of the gap and a few old fishermen's houses clinging stubbornly to the bottom of it. The old story says the devil himself came to the village once, was made so thoroughly unwelcome by the people that he stamped away in a fury, and his stamping foot tore this gorge into the living rock. Stand on that high bridge and look down into the cold green slot of water far below, and the devil's story will feel like the most reasonable explanation on offer. And if you want the entire coast all at once, in a single sweep, you leave the road behind completely. High above everything, along the very spine of the mountains, there is a footpath. It runs from a small village down toward the cliffs above Positano, threading through terraces and pine and bare hot rock, with the whole coastline unrolling slowly beneath your boots and the islands floating offshore in the blue haze. The people here have walked it so long, and the views are so far past ordinary, that its name was never going to be a modest one. They call it the Path of the Gods. Walk it once, in the gold of late afternoon, with the sea 1,000 meters straight down on one side and the warm rock close on the other, and you will not waste your breath arguing with the name either. There is no sound up there but the wind moving through the dry grass, the click of stones underfoot, a hawk somewhere riding the thermals off the cliff, and the faraway hush of the sea so far below it does not seem connected to you at all. You pass a single farmhouse with goats. You pass terraces gone wild. And the whole time the coast is laid out under you like a map of itself, every town you have visited reduced to a scatter of pale dots clinging to the rock, the road a thin gray thread, the boats white commas on the blue. At the end the path tips downward and pours you out, eventually, through hundreds of stone steps, into the top of Positano, your legs shaking, your shirt soaked through, and the first thing you want, the only thing you want, is to get down to that water and into it. And the water, when you reach it, is so clear and so cold and so deep a blue that you forget your own name for a second, floating on your back, looking up at the whole coast rising over you, and you do not once think to look down at what might be resting on the bottom. Now, the water. But not yet the harbor. First, a cave. Because between two of the towns, at the foot of the cliffs near a place called Conca dei Marini, there is an opening in the rock at the level of the sea, and you go in by small boat, ducking your head under the low stone lip, out of the bright hot day and into a hush. And then your eyes adjust, and the whole cave is glowing. Green. An impossible, lit from within emerald green, because the sunlight outside cannot get in through the entrance, so it comes up instead through a hidden mouth below the waterline. passing through the seawater and flooding the entire grotto with green light from underneath, so that the water does not look like water at all. It looks like liquid jade, and the boat seems to float on top of light itself, and the rock above you shivers with reflected ripples. And down on the floor of the cave, deep under that green water, there is a small ceramic nativity scene, figures placed on the seabed years ago, watching up through the glow. People go quiet in there too. It is the same quiet as the terrace of infinity, the quiet of a place that does not need you to say anything. Hold the memory of looking down through bright water at something resting on the bottom. Because now we come back to the harbor, and we do it again, and this time what is resting on the bottom is a city. Come all the way back down to where we began. The harbor of Amalfi town, the postcard, the turquoise, the little boats. The swimmers floating on their backs with their eyes shut against the sun, rocking gently in the wash. The exact image you have seen 1,000 times, the one you carried into this video without thinking. And look down, through the water, past the swimmers, because under that bright, ordinary, perfectly beautiful surface, there is a city. Remember the Republic. Remember the 4,000 people who once divided the sea with Venice. Their Amalfi was larger than the one you are standing in now. Its harbor was busier, its waterfront longer and grander, its wealth heavier in the hand. And then, in the year 1343, the sea took a great deal of it back in a single night. A violent storm, paired with the shudder of an earthquake, struck the coast and tore much of the old port apart, and a portion of that medieval town slid down into the Gulf and never rose again. The waterfront that once helped rule the Mediterranean is down there right now, beneath the floating swimmers, beneath the pleasure boats and the painted hulls, beneath the same turquoise that fills every single photograph anyone has ever taken of this place and called it paradise. So picture it one more time, the whole thing, all at once. Picture the image you carried in your head before any of this began. The pastel houses. The blue water. The lemons the size of your two hands. And now picture everything folded underneath it. A sunken republic resting on the dark seabed. A Roman villa 11 meters under a church, its frescoes still impossibly bright. An apostle in a crypt. The cliffs above the road quilted with stone walls older than most nations, and men carrying their whole harvest down them at dawn on their own backs. A green valley, where one last mill still presses the paper of the Pope. Barrels in Cetara dripping the sauce of fallen Rome, drop by amber drop, the compass needle that found north and opened the oceans. Layer beneath layer beneath layer, every one of them folded quietly into a town of 4,000 people that you were so sure you already knew from a screen. That is the real secret of this coast, and it turns out to be the gentlest secret in the entire world. It does not hide because it is forbidden, or dangerous, or lost. It hides because it is generous. It sets the one easy, glorious view out front, the one everybody photographs and nobody forgets, and it keeps everything else just slightly out of the frame. Just up the staircase. Just behind the headland. Just under the floor. Just beneath the surface of the water, waiting, patiently, the whole time, for the small handful of people who think to look a little harder. You have seen this place 1,000 times. And until right now, you had never once truly seen it. So here is the only question worth leaving you with, and it is bigger than this coast. The next time a single photograph of somewhere beautiful stops you in your scrolling, somewhere you feel certain you already understand, ask yourself what is sitting just outside the edge of the frame. What is up the staircase the crowd never bothers to climb? What is down under the water where no one ever looks? Because if a town of 4,000 people can quietly hold a sunken empire, a buried Roman villa, an apostle, the Pope's own paper and the compass that opened the oceans, all of it tucked behind one pretty picture, then the picture was never the place at all. It was only ever the door. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you on Unseen Countries.